In the middle of the 1800s, when America's frontier was still wild and untamed, a boy named James Butler Hickok was born. Nobody could have known that this quiet child from Illinois would one day become a symbol of courage, justice, and adventure, known to the world as Wild Bill Hickok. His story would echo through saloons, dusty streets, and dime novels, shaping the image of the Wild West for generations to come. James Hickok was born on May 27, 1837, in a small town called Homer, now known as Troy Grove, Illinois. His parents were hardworking people who believed in honesty and fairness. They taught young James to respect others and stand up for what was right. The Hickok family's home was also a stop on the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape to freedom. From a young age, James saw what bravery looked like, not with guns or violence, but with quiet strength and moral courage. Even as a boy, James was different. He was tall, lean, and quick on his feet. He had sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything around him. Neighbors said he was polite but fearless, and that he could shoot straight even before he was old enough to vote. He loved the stories of adventure that travelers brought with them, tales of buffalo hunters, explorers, and outlaws who lived by their own rules. Somewhere deep inside, he knew he didn't belong on a farm. The open frontier was calling him. When James was a teenager, he left home to find work and adventure. The world beyond Illinois was wild and full of danger. He found a job as a stagecoach driver for the Overland Stage Company, guiding horse-drawn coaches across rough trails filled with bandits, storms, and wild animals. The work was hard, but Hickok thrived on the challenge. Every journey tested his courage. Every night under the stars made him feel more alive. He carried passengers, mail, and money through lands where one mistake could cost him his life. It was during one of these trips that Hickok's courage was first tested. The story goes that his coach was attacked by outlaws. Instead of running, Hickok fought back. He killed several attackers and protected everyone in his care. From that day forward, he was no longer just James Hickok. He was Wild Bill, a name that carried both respect and fear. Nobody knew exactly who first called him that, but it fit him perfectly. Wild Bill, the man who faced danger and never backed down. Wild Bill's legend began to grow. People told stories about his bravery, each one bigger than the last. Some said he could shoot the wings off a fly from 20 paces. Others claimed he once killed a bear with a knife. The truth didn't matter much anymore. What mattered was that Wild Bill Hickok had become a name whispered with awe around campfires and saloons across the West. In those early years, Hickok's life was not just about fighting or shooting. He was also a man who loved laughter and friendship. He was known for his sense of humor, his calm voice, and his respect for women. Unlike many men of his time, he carried himself with dignity. Even when he walked into a saloon with guns at his side and eyes that could freeze a room, he treated people fairly. But he also made it clear he wouldn't hesitate to use his weapons if someone crossed the line. Behind his tough exterior, Hickok had a sense of justice that came from his upbringing. He believed in right and wrong, even when the law was weak or corrupt. To him, fairness was sacred. He hated bullies and respected bravery. That belief would later guide him when he became a lawman, a peacekeeper in some of the roughest towns in America. As the years passed, the frontier grew more dangerous, but Hickok seemed to belong to that danger. He was drawn to it, shaped by it. His name spread across states, from Kansas to Missouri to the Dakota Territory. Newspapers began to write about him, sometimes with facts, sometimes with wild imagination. Dime novels turned him into a larger-than-life hero, a fearless gunslinger who could outdraw anyone. But few knew the real man behind the legend. The man who sometimes felt lonely, tired, and hunted by the reputation that followed him everywhere. Everywhere he went, Hickok found both admiration and jealousy. Young men wanted to be like him, while others wanted to prove they were faster than him with a gun. Some challenged him just to say they had faced the great Wild Bill. It was the price of fame in a world where legends were made with bullets. Still, Hickok never bragged about his kills or his fame. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man trying to survive in a dangerous world. To him, each day on the frontier was a test of courage, discipline, and luck. He once said, "The West is no place for the weak. Out here, a man must be his own law." Those words summed up his life. Always standing firm, always ready and always alone. By the time the 1860s arrived, Wild Bill Hickok had already become a living legend. He had survived countless fights, earned the respect of soldiers and scouts, and built a reputation that would outlive him. But his story was just beginning. Ahead lay war, fame, and tragedy. He would become a soldier, a spy, a lawman, and finally, a gambler whose name would be forever linked to one of the most famous deaths in Western history. For now, though he was simply Wild Bill, a man riding through the dust of the American frontier, with a revolver at his side, a calm smile on his face, and destiny waiting just beyond the horizon. The sun was rising over the endless plains when Wild Bill Hickok rode out toward the frontier. The air was sharp, the land wide and empty. Dust rose from the hooves of his horse, and the road ahead stretched like a promise, or a warning. For Hickok, it was both. He was leaving behind the quiet farms and safe towns of the East and riding into a world where the law was a whisper and courage was all a man could count on. The American frontier in the 1850s was wild, dangerous, and full of opportunity. Towns were just beginning to grow. Gold seekers, settlers, soldiers, and outlaws all moved west together. There were no fences, no real rules, just men and women trying to survive. For someone like Hickok, brave, restless, and ready for adventure, it was the perfect place to make a name. He found work with the Russell, Majors and Waddell Freight Company, one of the biggest transportation companies in the West. They were the ones who would later start the Pony Express, the legendary mail service that carried letters faster than ever before. Hickok's job was to drive wagons full of goods across hundreds of miles of dangerous land. It was hard work, but he was made for it. Driving a stagecoach was no small thing. The wagons were heavy, the horses strong but unpredictable, and the trails rough and filled with danger. Sometimes the threat came from nature, floods, storms, or wild animals. Other times it came from men, bandits, hostile raiders, or thieves who waited in the shadows. But Hickok had nerves of steel. He guided those wagons through chaos and came out alive every time. His passengers trusted him. Even when bullets flew, Hickok's hands never shook on the reins. It was during these years that Hickok truly became part of the frontier. He learned to read the land, the sound of a river, the smell of the wind, the sign of approaching riders. He also learned that the West had its own kind of justice. There were no judges or jails. A man's word and his gun were his only protection. One story from this time shows exactly what kind of man Hickok was. Around 1858, while working as a stagecoach driver in Nebraska, he got into a deadly fight with a grizzly bear. According to old accounts, the attack came out of nowhere. The bear charged him and his horses, flipping the wagon. Hickok fought with his knife, killing the beast, but suffering terrible injuries. It took him weeks to recover, and the story spread fast. To many, it proved he was more than just brave. He was unstoppable. After recovering, Hickok returned to work, now more famous than before. People began calling him Wild Bill, though nobody was sure why. Some said it was because of his wild courage. Others claimed it was because of his wild hair and fierce look. Whatever the reason, the name stuck, and the legend began to grow. By the early 1860s, America was on the edge of war. The Civil War was beginning, and the country was dividing between North and South. Hickok joined the Union Army as a scout and spy. His experience on the frontier made him perfect for the job. He could move quietly through rough country, track enemies, and survive for days with little food or water. His skills with a gun and his sharp instincts made him a valuable soldier. He served under General James Lane and others, working as a courier, guide, and sharpshooter. Some stories say he even carried secret messages behind enemy lines disguised as a Confederate. He took part in raids and skirmishes, always managing to escape unharmed. His courage and calm under fire earned him the respect of his commanders and the admiration of his men. It was during the war that Hickok's name spread beyond the army. Soldiers told stories about him, stories that grew bigger with every retelling. Some said he could shoot 6 men before any of them drew their guns. Others claimed he could see in the dark, ride without a saddle, and never miss a target. The truth was simple. Hickok was a man of focus and confidence. When he took aim, he didn't hesitate. After the war, the frontier was changing. Towns were growing, railroads were pushing west, and lawlessness was spreading with them. Men like Hickok, experienced gunmen who understood both order and chaos, were in high demand. He had already earned a reputation as a man who could keep peace where others failed. But fame came with a cost. People began to recognize him wherever he went. Some admired him, while others wanted to test him. There were always men looking to make their own name by killing a legend. Hickok never looked for fights, but he never ran from them either. He once said, "I never killed a man who didn't need killing." Those words defined his code, simple, cold, and just. He didn't shoot for pleasure or pride. He shot only when it was him or the other man. In a world without law, he was his own judge and jury. By the time the war ended, Wild Bill Hickok had seen more death, danger, and heroism than most men could imagine. He had survived bear attacks, gunfights, and ambushes. He had crossed deserts and rivers, fought in battles, and stared down men who wanted him dead. But his journey was far from over. Ahead lay his most famous years, as a lawman in Kansas and the Dakotas, where he would face outlaws, gamblers, and killers in dusty towns that lived by the gun. His story would soon become part of American history, blending truth and legend until the two were impossible to tell apart. For now, as he rode across the endless plains under a blood-red sunset, the young man from Illinois had become something else. A frontier hero, a living myth. Wild Bill Hickok had found his place in the untamed heart of America. The Civil War had torn America in two. Brothers fought brothers, towns split apart, and the land was soaked in fear and blood. In that chaos, men with sharp eyes, strong hearts, and steady hands were in high demand. Among those men was Wild Bill Hickok, a soldier, a scout, and a man who could ride into danger without a second thought. By the time the war began, Hickok had already seen his share of violence. He had driven stagecoaches through bandit country, fought a grizzly bear, and lived through gunfights that would have killed lesser men. But now, the fight was bigger. The Civil War wasn't about gold or revenge. It was about survival and loyalty. Hickok joined the Union Army, determined to serve the side he believed was right. He started as a teamster, a driver who carried supplies to soldiers on the front lines. But it didn't take long for his superiors to notice his skill. Hickok was a natural scout, fast, fearless, and able to move quietly through dangerous territory. He knew how to read tracks, how to spot an ambush before it happened, and how to vanish into the trees like a ghost. Before long, he was assigned to work as a spy and scout for the Union. In those days, being a scout was one of the most dangerous jobs a man could have. Scouts rode far ahead of the army, often alone, to gather information about enemy positions. They had no backup, no safe camp to return to, and no room for mistakes. One wrong move could mean death, but Hickok seemed born for it. He was said to have an almost supernatural sense of awareness. He could hear a horse's step long before anyone else did. He could spot a rifle barrel glinting in the sunlight from half a mile away. And when it came to shooting, few men could match him. His revolvers were always clean, always ready. Some soldiers said they felt safer just knowing Wild Bill was out there somewhere, watching the horizon. Hickok served in Kansas and Missouri, where the war was especially brutal. It wasn't just soldiers fighting soldier, it was neighbors turning on neighbors. Guerrilla warfare was common. Raiders and bushwhackers burned farms, stole supplies, and left chaos in their wake. Hickok rode through all of it, carrying messages, rescuing soldiers, and gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. One story tells of a night when Hickok was ambushed by Confederate spies near Independence, Missouri. Outnumbered and caught off guard, he still managed to shoot his way out, killing several attackers before disappearing into the darkness. He returned to camp the next morning, dirty, tired, but alive, carrying the message he had been sent to deliver. That was how he worked, quiet, efficient, and unbreakable. Hickok's bravery caught the attention of his commanders, and his legend grew. Soldiers began to tell stories about him around campfires. Some said he could shoot the buttons off a man's coat without hitting the fabric. Others swore he once rode straight through enemy lines just to rescue a wounded comrade. Whether all the stories were true or not didn't matter. They all had the same message. Wild Bill Hickok was a man you could count on when death was close. During his time as a spy, Hickok worked with another famous frontier figure, Buffalo Bill Cody, who was just a teenager at the time. The two would later become close friends and share adventures that filled dime novels for decades. Cody would often say that Hickok was the bravest man he ever met, calm, polite, and deadly when needed. But war has a way of changing men, and it changed Hickok too. The endless bloodshed, the burning towns, the screams of dying soldiers, they left marks no one could see. After years of scouting, spying, and fighting, he carried ghosts with him wherever he went. Still, Hickok's loyalty never wavered. He believed in the Union cause and did his duty until the war's end. When the fighting stopped in 1865, he left the army with a reputation as one of the finest scouts and marksmen in the West. But peace didn't come easy. America was broken, and the frontier was still lawless. Men like Hickok didn't fit into quiet towns or peaceful farms. They belonged out where danger still rode the wind. After the war, Hickok drifted for a time, taking odd jobs as a scout for the government and as a lawman in new frontier towns. His name was already famous. Newspapers had begun to print stories about his war exploits, mixing truth and fiction until the line between them disappeared. Some called him a hero, others a killer, but everyone wanted to meet him. Though he never sought fame, Hickok understood its power. It could open doors, or put a target on your back. Everywhere he went, people wanted to see the man who could outdraw anyone. Gunfighters came looking for him, hoping to make their name by defeating him. But Hickok wasn't interested in glory. He lived by one rule: never draw your gun unless you must. And if you do, make sure you're the one still standing. In the quiet moments, away from the noise of gunfire and crowds, Hickok sometimes talked about the war. He rarely bragged. He didn't see himself as a hero. He spoke of fallen soldiers and the lives lost for a cause that left scars across the country. Behind his calm eyes was the weariness of a man who had seen too much and trusted too little. Yet even with that heaviness, he carried himself with grace. Dressed in his long coat with pistols on each hip and hair flowing past his shoulders, he became the image of the classic Western lawman, a symbol of courage and danger wrapped into one. By the late 1860s, Wild Bill Hickok's life was moving toward its most famous chapters. The war had made him a fighter, but the peace that followed would make him a legend. Ahead lay gunfights, justice, betrayal, and fame, all waiting for the man who lived by his own code, the man who refused to be tamed by the world around him. The soldier of shadows was about to become the most famous lawman the West had ever seen. The year was 1865, and America was still bleeding from the Civil War. Towns were trying to rebuild, soldiers were returning home, and the frontier was growing wilder by the day. Out west, the law was thin, and courage was the only currency that mattered. It was in this restless time that Wild Bill Hickok walked into history, into a dusty Missouri town called Springfield, and faced a moment that would define the legend of the Wild West itself. By then, Hickok was already known as a man not to be crossed. He had served as a Union scout, survived ambushes, and earned respect wherever he rode. His calm, polite manner made him liked, but his sharp eyes and steady hands made him feared. Springfield was a rough place, full of gamblers, drifters, and broken men still haunted by war. It was a town that needed peace, but found trouble around every corner. Wild Bill worked there as a lawman and gambler, spending his days keeping order and his nights at the poker table. He was skilled with cards, but even better with his guns, a pair of ivory-handled Colt revolvers that hung low at his sides. He didn't draw them often, but everyone knew what would happen if he did. One of Hickok's gambling partners was a man named Davis Tutt, a former Confederate soldier. At first they were friends, two skilled gamblers who understood risk and reward. They shared drinks, games, and stories. But friendship in the frontier was fragile, and pride was a dangerous thing. Their friendship began to crack over debts. Tutt had loaned Hickok money, and Hickok owed him more than he could pay. Hickok, proud and confident, refused to let Tutt embarrass him in public. Tutt, angry and insulted, wanted revenge, not with fists, but with humiliation. One evening inside a crowded saloon, their argument boiled over. Tutt claimed Hickok owed him $45. Hickok disagreed. Voices rose, chairs scraped, and the crowd grew quiet. Hickok told Tutt calmly that he would not pay the full amount, only what he truly owed. Tutt's face twisted with anger. He said something no man should say in front of a crowd. Then he did something worse. Tutt picked up Hickok's gold pocket watch, which Hickok had left on the table as security for a smaller debt, and declared he would wear it through town the next day. That watch was more than gold. It was pride. To wear another man's watch was to mock him, to claim dominance in front of everyone. Hickok stood, his eyes cold and voice calm. "You better not cross the square wearing that watch," he said. "If you do, I'll shoot you." The bar went silent. No one doubted he meant it. The next day, the town of Springfield held its breath. Rumors spread fast. Davis Tutt was walking through the public square, Hickok's watch hanging from his vest. Men gathered on rooftops, women peeked from windows. Everyone knew what was coming. It was the moment the frontier had been waiting for. A gunfight in broad daylight, not in anger or chaos, but with pride and purpose. Wild Bill appeared on the opposite side of the square. The summer sun was blazing, dust swirling in the air. He walked slowly, confidently, one hand resting near his revolver. Tutt stood waiting, his face pale but set. The crowd held its breath. They stopped about 75 yards apart, far more distance than most men could shoot accurately. But these weren't ordinary men. For a few long seconds they stared at each other, frozen in silence. Then, almost as one, both men reached for their guns. A single shot cracked through the air. Tutt staggered, clutched his chest, and fell to the ground. The people gasped. Hickok stood still, his revolver smoking in his hand. Davis Tutt was dead before he hit the dirt. It was over in seconds, but that moment would echo for centuries. It was the first recorded quick-draw duel in American history, the event that would define the gunfighter myth forever. The local sheriff arrested Hickok, and he was charged with manslaughter. But even in the courtroom, the crowd treated him like a hero. Witnesses said Tutt had provoked him, and that Hickok had warned him clearly. After a short trial, the jury found him not guilty. Wild Bill Hickok walked free, his legend now carved in stone. Newspapers picked up the story, and soon the name Wild Bill Hickok spread across the country. Dime novel writers turned him into a hero, the brave gunslinger who faced his enemies with courage and honor. They exaggerated the story, of course. Some said he shot Tutt from hundreds of feet away, others claimed he fired 2 guns at once. But Hickok didn't correct them. He didn't need to. The truth was already strong enough. After the duel, Wild Bill became a man everyone wanted to see, and no one wanted to face. His fame grew faster than he could control it. In every saloon he entered, whispers followed. Some men admired him, others feared him, but a few wanted to challenge him, to see if the stories were true. For Hickok, fame was both a blessing and a curse. It brought him respect and opportunity, but also danger. Every young gunman in the West wanted to test himself against the man who killed Davis Tutt in a fair fight. Hickok didn't look for trouble, but trouble found him anyway. Still, deep down, Wild Bill remained calm and thoughtful. He never saw himself as a killer. He saw himself as a man doing what needed to be done. He didn't shoot to boast, he shot to survive. And as the legend of that single gunshot spread from one town to another, the frontier found its first true hero, a man of courage, pride, and deadly precision. The duel in Springfield made Wild Bill Hickok more than a man. It made him a myth, the symbol of justice in a land without rules. But the frontier was far from finished with him. Ahead lay years of violence, fame, and heartbreak, where every step he took would pull him deeper into the legend and closer to his fate. The legend of Wild Bill Hickok had spread far beyond Missouri. The gunfight in Springfield had made him a hero across the frontier. Newspapers called him the fastest gun in the West. Dime novels described him as half man, half myth, a perfect mix of courage and danger. But Hickok was no storybook character. He was a man made for chaos, and the Wild West had plenty of it. By the late 1860s, towns were springing up everywhere, raw, loud, and filled with men chasing gold, whiskey, or trouble. The railroads were expanding, bringing fortune and lawlessness in equal measure. Outlaws roamed freely, gamblers cheated in smoky saloons, and killings were common. People needed protection. They needed someone who could bring order to the madness. They needed a man like Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok became a lawman, first as a deputy U.S. Marshal, then as a sheriff and city marshal in several frontier towns, including Hays City and Abilene, Kansas. These were rough places where the law was more suggestion than rule. When he arrived in town, people could feel the air change. He was tall and lean, with long hair, calm eyes, and a presence that could silence a room. His twin ivory-handled Colt pistols gleamed at his hips, and everyone knew what they could do. In Hays City, Hickok's reputation was put to the test almost immediately. The town was full of drunken soldiers and restless cowboys looking for fights. One night, 2 soldiers from the 7th Cavalry started causing trouble, shooting their guns in the street. Hickok stepped out into the cold night, His boots echoing on the wooden boardwalk. He called out to them, telling them to drop their weapons. They laughed. One raised his gun. Hickok didn't hesitate. 2 shots cracked through the air. Both men dropped where they stood. The street went quiet. Hickok holstered his guns, turned, and walked back inside without saying a word. From that night on, nobody doubted who was in charge. Despite his deadly skill, Hickok wasn't a man who liked violence. He believed in fairness. He gave warnings, offered chances, and avoided bloodshed whenever possible. But when he drew his gun, it was always for a reason. He once told a reporter, "I never killed a man who didn't need killing." It wasn't bravado, it was truth. In a place where justice was scarce, Hickok carried it on his shoulders. In 1869, Hickok moved to Ellsworth, Kansas, and later became Marshal of Abilene, one of the wildest towns on the frontier. Abilene was booming with cattle drives, and cowboys from Texas filled its saloons every night. Gambling, drinking, and gunfights were daily events. The town council needed someone who could bring peace, and they hired the only man brave enough to do it. When Wild Bill Hickok rode into Abilene, people stared. He didn't need to announce himself. His legend had arrived before he did. He set strict rules. No guns inside town limits, no brawls in the streets, and no mercy for outlaws. Some laughed at first, but soon learned that Hickok meant every word. One of his biggest challenges came when a group of rowdy cowboys refused to obey his orders. They drew their weapons and fired at him in the street. Hickok spun and shot with deadly precision. In seconds, 2 men lay dead and another wounded. The rest surrendered without a fight. It was said he barely blinked. Even the toughest men respected him. He could stare down a killer and make him drop his gun without a shot fired. Yet Hickok also had a soft side. He was known to help widows, stop fights before they started, and treat even the worst criminals with dignity. He never cursed or bullied, and he spoke to everyone, rich or poor, with the same calm tone. But life as a lawman wasn't easy. Every day brought new enemies. Every corner hid danger. Hickok lived under constant threat, never knowing who might challenge him next. His fame made him a target. Young gunfighters came from far and wide just to test him, to prove they could outdraw the great Wild Bill. Few ever tried twice. In Abilene, one tragedy haunted him forever. During a chaotic gunfight with outlaws, Hickok accidentally shot and killed his own deputy and friend, Mike Williams. The mistake broke him. Though he was cleared of wrongdoing, the guilt never left. After that, he lost his taste for the badge. He resigned as marshal soon after, saying, "I'll never wear the star again." He had kept the peace in some of the wildest towns in America, but it had cost him part of his soul. Hickok drifted after that, working as a scout for the U.S. Army, gambling in saloons and living off his growing fame. He became a man of stories, some true, some exaggerated, but all powerful. Wherever he went, people whispered his name. Some said he could draw and shoot before a man could blink. Others said he once faced down 10 gunmen and walked away untouched. The truth didn't matter anymore. Wild Bill Hickok had become a legend, a symbol of justice in a world without rules, but legends can't escape fate. Hickok's life as a lawman had brought him both glory and pain. He had faced down killers, tamed wild towns, and earned respect through courage and honor. Yet inside he carried the weight of every man he had ever shot, every friend he had ever lost, and every moment he couldn't change. He was tired, not of life, but of fighting it. The West was changing fast, and the old ways were dying. Soon there would be railroads, sheriffs, and real law. Men like Wild Bill Hickok, the lone gunmen who lived by courage and instinct, were becoming part of the past. Still, his story was far from over. Ahead waited the quiet, dusty town of Deadwood, where cards, whiskey, and one fateful bullet would decide how the legend of Wild Bill Hickok would end. By the time the 1870s arrived, Wild Bill Hickok was no longer just a man. He was a living legend. His name traveled faster than the trains and telegraphs that crossed the growing nation. Newspapers called him the deadliest gun in America, and dime novels painted him as a hero who could tame any town, outshoot any outlaw, and charm any woman. But fame, especially in the Wild West, was never a gift. It was a curse that rode beside him everywhere he went. People came from all over just to get a glimpse of Wild Bill. They wanted to shake his hand, share a drink with him, or hear his stories. Some even wanted to test him. They didn't care that the man behind the legend was tired, lonely, and haunted by the things he had seen. To them, he was a figure from their dreams, the gunslinger who could never be beaten. In truth, Hickok never saw himself that way. He didn't boast or brag. He didn't want to be famous. He had killed men, yes, but never for pride, always for survival. Each time he pulled the trigger, he carried that memory with him. He had seen too much death to think of it as glory. Fame might have given him respect, but it also stole his peace. When he walked into a saloon, the room went silent. Some men smiled nervously. Others reached for their guns, just to see if the stories were true. Hickok would calmly rest a hand on his revolver, his eyes cold and unblinking, and say, "Let's not start what we can't finish." Most men backed down. But not all. A few tried their luck, and died for it. He once told a friend, "When a man kills, even in self-defense, he dies a little inside." Those words came from a place deep within him. Hickok wasn't proud of his legend. It had made him famous, yes, but it had also made him a target. He was trapped by the very myth that made him immortal. After leaving Abilene, he drifted across the frontier, moving from one town to another. He gambled, performed as a scout for the army, and tried to live quietly, though quiet rarely lasted long. In every town, he was the main attraction. "Wild Bill is here!" And crowds followed him everywhere. In 1871, he joined Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, where he performed as himself, the famous gunslinger. On stage, he would reenact his gunfights, tell stories of the frontier, and pose for cheering audiences. But he hated it. Hickok wasn't an actor. He was a real man who had lived those moments, and reliving them for applause didn't sit right with him. After one season, he left the show and returned to gambling, trying to disappear from the noise of fame. But the years were catching up with him. His eyesight was failing, likely from old injuries or illness. The man who could once hit a target from 100 yards was now struggling to see clearly. It was a cruel twist of fate. For a gunslinger, bad eyes meant slow hands, and slow hands meant death. Still, he refused to stop. He had lived too long by instinct to change now. Around this time, Hickok met Agnes Lake, a circus owner and performer. She was intelligent, kind, and strong, the sort of woman who understood men like him. Against all odds, the hardened Lawman fell in love. In March 1876, they married in Cheyenne, Wyoming. For the first time in years, Hickok seemed truly happy. He spoke about settling down, leaving behind the gunfights and the wandering life. But the West had one more chapter waiting for him. In the summer of 1876, Hickok said goodbye to his wife and headed north to the Dakota Territory. He told Agnes he'd earn some money through gambling and return soon. His destination was a gold rush town called Deadwood, a place full of dreamers, drifters, and outlaws. Deadwood wasn't just rough, it was wild. There were no laws, no sheriffs, and no real order. Gold seekers came from everywhere, filling the town with noise, whiskey, and greed. To a man like Wild Bill Hickok, it felt like stepping into the heart of chaos. When he arrived, the people of Deadwood treated him like a celebrity. Men offered him drinks, women smiled, and gamblers invited him to their tables. He tried to keep a low profile, but it was impossible. Everyone knew his face, the long hair, the mustache, the cool stare. Hickok couldn't hide, and he didn't really try. He played poker, told stories, and laughed softly at the wild rumors about his life. But inside, he was restless. His eyesight was worse, and he could feel time catching up with him. Every day he was surrounded by strangers, some friendly, some dangerous. And in Deadwood, everyone carried a gun. He had grown cautious. He never sat with his back to a door. It was a habit born of survival, a rule that had saved his life many times. But one day, that rule would fail him. As his fame grew, so did the number of enemies who wanted to challenge it. Some hated him for his reputation. Others simply wanted to kill the legend to make their own name. Hickok could sense danger in the air, but he carried on as always. Calm, polite, but always ready. He spent his nights in the saloons, his days wandering the camp streets. People greeted him everywhere. Some asked for stories, others asked for duels. Hickok always refused to draw unless he had to. But in Deadwood, fate was getting ready to deal its final hand. Wild Bill Hickok had lived his whole life between law and chaos, courage and fear. He had survived every gunfight, every ambush, every mistake. But now, surrounded by fame, whispers, and enemies he couldn't see clearly anymore, he was running out of luck. He was a man out of time, a hero in a world that was quickly changing. And though he didn't know it, the legend of Wild Bill was only one gunshot away from becoming immortal. The gold rush town of Deadwood was loud, dirty, and alive with greed. Wooden shacks lined muddy streets, and every doorway seemed to hold a promise: gold, whiskey, or danger. It was the kind of place where fortunes were made in the morning and lost by nightfall. It was also the perfect place for a man like Wild Bill Hickok, who had lived his life balancing between law and chaos. By 1876, Wild Bill was no longer a lawman, no longer a scout. His eyesight had grown weak, and his reflexes were slower than they once were. But one skill still served him well: gambling. Poker, faro, and blackjack had become his way of life. It wasn't just a game to him. It was survival, patience, and instinct, the same instincts that had kept him alive for years. Hickok arrived in Deadwood that summer with his old friend Charlie Utter, leading a wagon train filled with prospectors and adventurers. The town was booming with talk of gold in the Black Hills. Hickok wasn't there to mine. He was there to play cards, earn money, and maybe find a bit of peace in the noise. He checked into a small room in town and quickly became a familiar face in the saloons. He spent most of his nights at Nuttall and Mann's No. 10 Saloon, a rough wooden bar filled with laughter, smoke, and the clinking of poker chips. There he would sit quietly, his long hair falling over his shoulders, his mustache neat, his eyes watchful even through the blur of age. Hickok's way of playing cards was different from most gamblers. He didn't talk much, didn't brag, and didn't lose his temper. He played slow, thoughtful, and calm. When he won, he smiled politely. When he lost, he didn't flinch. The men at his table often forgot that the man across from them was one of the most dangerous gunfighters who had ever lived. But even as he played, Hickok could feel the years pressing down on him. The noise, the crowds, the endless faces, and they made him uneasy. He had lived too long with danger to ignore the feeling when it crept close. Sometimes, in the middle of a game, he would pause, sensing something behind him. His hand would drift toward his gun, and his eyes would narrow. The others would laugh nervously, but he never did. He once said, "When a man's time comes, it comes." But I won't make it easy for him. He had one habit that everyone in Deadwood knew. He never sat with his back to the door. Years of experience had taught him that trouble always came from behind. If someone wanted to draw on him, they would have to do it face to face. He lived by that rule until the day he broke it. In those last weeks in Deadwood, Hickok was surrounded by strangers. Some were friendly, some were dangerous. Among them was a young, restless drifter named Jack McCall, a man known for his temper and bad luck at cards. Hickok had played with him once and won a small pot. When McCall ran out of money, Hickok quietly gave him back enough coins to buy breakfast. It was a gesture of kindness, but it was received as an insult. McCall's pride couldn't stand the pity. As days passed, the tension around Hickok grew. He felt watched, followed, but said nothing. Maybe it was the old instinct in him, the same feeling that had saved him in ambushes and gunfights. But this time it wouldn't be enough. Hickok kept to his daily routine: a few hands of poker, a few quiet drinks, and long walks through the crowded camp. He talked little, smiled less. Friends said he seemed tired, distant, as if he knew something was coming. Some nights he would sit by himself, sipping whiskey, staring into the fire. "A man can't outrun his own legend," he said once, softly. Still, when the cards were dealt, he came alive again. The table was his battlefield, the deck his weapon. Each hand was a test of patience, luck, and will. He watched every move, every blink, every nervous twitch. To him, poker wasn't gambling. It was reading men's souls. But life as a gambler was lonely. He missed his wife, Agnes, back in Wyoming. He wrote her letters, promising to return soon with enough money to start fresh. In those letters, he was gentle and thoughtful, a far cry from the hardened gunfighter people imagined. "My dear Agnes," he wrote, "and don't worry about me. I am safe and doing well. I think of you often and hope to be with you soon." Those letters would become his last words to her. In Deadwood, time seemed to stand still. The town was lawless, wild, and beautiful in its own rough way. Hickok, even with his fading sight, could still see that it was a place built on greed and doomed to chaos. But he stayed. Maybe he was chasing one last game, or maybe he was just tired of running. He continued to play poker at Nuttall and Mann's saloon almost every day. People gathered just to watch him. The great Wild Bill Hickok, the man of legend, sitting quietly at a table, cards in one hand, whiskey in the other. His hair silvered in the lamplight, his expression calm and unreadable. No one knew it then. But every game he played brought him closer to his final hand. The man who had lived his entire life with his back to the wall was about to make one fatal mistake. The gambler who had faced death and beaten it time after time was now staring into the last bet he would ever make. And somewhere in the dark corners of that saloon, a young bitter man named Jack McCall was waiting, a pistol hidden beneath his coat, revenge burning in his heart. The cards were on the table. The chips were stacked. The end of an era was sitting just one seat behind him. The morning of August 2nd, 1876, began like any other in Deadwood, Dakota Territory. The mining town was alive with noise, the clang of hammers, the laughter from saloons, and the steady hum of men chasing gold dreams. But for Wild Bill Hickok, that morning carried an uneasy calm, a feeling that something unseen was drawing close. He woke early in his small rented room, washed his face in a cracked basin, and dressed with his usual care. Even in the roughest towns, Hickok kept a gentleman's touch. His boots were polished, his coat neat, his revolvers clean and loaded. He moved slowly as if every motion mattered. He had lived long enough to know that any day could be the last. Downstairs he met a few friends, including Charlie Utter, his loyal companion and fellow frontiersman. They shared breakfast and small talk, nothing out of the ordinary. But Hickok seemed distant. He stared out the window for a long time, watching the town bustle under the early sun. "Bill," Utter said, noticing his silence, "you're quieter than usual." Hickok smiled faintly. "Just tired, Charlie. The cards have been running cold lately." He paused, his eyes narrowing as if seeing something far away. Maybe I'll sit out today. But he didn't. He couldn't. The saloon was his last familiar place, noisy, smoky, and full of life. It was where he felt most at home, where the rhythm of the cards and the weight of the chips drowned out the ghosts that followed him. So as the sun climbed higher, Wild Bill Hickok walked down Deadwood's dirt street toward Nuttall and Mann's No. 10 saloon. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the clatter of glasses. Hickok greeted a few men, nodded politely, and took a seat at a poker table. The spot he wanted, the one facing the door, was already taken. He hesitated. For years he had followed one rule: never sit with your back to the door. He had said it countless times. It was his code of survival. But today, for some reason, he broke it. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he didn't want to make a scene. Maybe fate had already decided. He sat down with his back to the entrance. The game began. The cards shuffled, the chips clinked, the whiskey flowed. Hickok played calmly, his worn hands moving with quiet grace. His sight was weak now, and he squinted to read his cards. The other men, Carl Mann, Captain Massey, Charlie Rich, and Dr. McCall, watched him closely, but nobody spoke much. When Hickok was at the table, there was always a certain respect in the air, almost like fear. Hours passed. The game went on. Hickok folded, bet, and won small pots. He seemed relaxed, but every now and then, he would glance at the reflections in the glass behind the bar. His way of keeping an eye on what he couldn't see directly. Then, without warning, the saloon doors creaked open. Jack McCall stepped inside. He moved slowly, his face pale, his hat pulled low. In his pocket, hidden beneath his coat, was a revolver. The men at the table barely noticed him. To them, he was just another miner, another drifter. But to Wild Bill Hickok, he was the ghost of a bad hand waiting to be played. McCall walked up behind him. He said nothing. Hickok didn't turn. Maybe he thought McCall was just another drunk passing through. Maybe he knew what was coming and chose not to run. Then, a flash, a thunderous crack, and smoke filled the room. Jack McCall's bullet struck the back of Hickok's head, passing through his skull and out his cheek. Wild Bill fell forward instantly, his cards slipping from his hand, 2 black aces and 2 black eights, forever remembered as the dead man's hand. The saloon erupted in screams. Chairs overturned, glasses shattered. McCall tried to flee but was tackled by onlookers. Someone shouted, "You've killed Wild Bill!" But it was too late. The man who had survived countless gunfights, ambushes, and wars was dead before he hit the floor. Charlie Utter rushed in moments later. He dropped to his knees beside his fallen friend. The sight broke him. Hickok's body lay still, his eyes half open, his expression strangely peaceful, as if he had finally found rest. News of the killing spread through Deadwood like wildfire. Men who had never met Hickok swore vengeance. Women wept. Even outlaws lowered their heads. The great Wild Bill Hickok, the lawman, the gunfighter, the gambler, was gone. McCall was tried that very night by an impromptu miners' court. He claimed he had killed Hickok in revenge, saying Wild Bill had once shot his brother. No proof was ever found. Some said McCall was simply jealous, others that he was drunk and foolish. Whatever the reason, the frontier court found him not guilty, a decision that outraged the nation. Months later, McCall was arrested again in a proper court in Yankton, Dakota Territory. This time, justice caught up with him. He was tried, found guilty of murder, and hanged in March 1877. His last words were a mumbled prayer, far from the noise and heat of Deadwood. Wild Bill Hickok was buried on a hill overlooking the town he never truly left. A simple wooden marker bore his name. Later, his remains were moved to a larger grave beside those of other frontier legends. Visitors came from across America to see where the greatest gunslinger of the West lay, and as the years passed, his story grew, retold in books, plays, and films. Some painted him as a saint, others as a sinner, but the truth was something deeper. Hickok wasn't perfect. He was brave, proud, and human, a man who lived by his own code in a world that had none. That final day in Deadwood wasn't just the end of Wild Bill Hickok. It was the end of an era, the last deal in the greatest game ever played on the frontier. The bullet that killed Wild Bill Hickok didn't just end a man's life, it sealed a legend. In the smoky chaos of Nuttall Man's No. 10 saloon, time seemed to stop. The man who had survived countless duels, battles, and ambushes now lay motionless, face down on a rough wooden floor, his cards still clutched in his lifeless hand. 2 black aces, 2 black eights, and 1 unknown card. That final, unfinished poker hand would become one of the most powerful symbols in American history, the dead man's hand. Outside, the streets of Deadwood fell silent as the news spread. People left their work, saloons closed early, and miners stood in disbelief. Some cried out in anger, others simply bowed their heads. The Wild West had lost its brightest, and most feared, son. Inside the saloon, Charlie Utter, Hickok's closest friend, knelt beside his fallen brother in arms. He gently turned Hickok over, his eyes glassy but still calm, almost peaceful. Utter's voice broke as he whispered, "Bill, you never had a chance." He ordered everyone to clear the room. Hickok deserved dignity, not the gawking stares of strangers. They laid him out on a billiard table and covered his face with a sheet. Outside, a small crowd gathered, whispering stories, each one a mixture of awe and sorrow. Some remembered the lawman who had brought peace to the wildest towns. Others recalled the gambler, always polite, always dangerous. Many couldn't believe that such a man could die so suddenly, so quietly, shot from behind like a thief. To the people of the frontier, Hickok had seemed almost immortal. He had stared down death too many times to lose this way. But maybe that was what made it so shocking, that even the greatest gunfighter couldn't escape fate. The next day, the miners of Deadwood built a coffin from pine boards and dressed Hickok in his best clothes. A black coat, white shirt, and his boots polished to a shine. Charlie Utter placed a lock of Hickok's long hair in a small envelope and kept it close for the rest of his life. He also made sure Hickok's body was buried on a hill overlooking the town, surrounded by trees and silence, far away from the noise and cards that had been his world. The marker on his grave read simply, "Wild Bill, J.B. Hickok, killed by the assassin Jack McCall, Deadwood, Black Hills, August 2nd, 1876. It was a humble farewell for a man whose name was already becoming legend. But the story didn't end there. The dead man's hand, those 2 black aces and 2 black eights, began to take on a life of its own. Newspapers across the country printed the tale. Illustrators drew scenes of the murder, and dime novelists turned it into a moral story of betrayal and fate. The hand became a symbol of death, bad luck, and destiny. To this day, gamblers still shiver when they see it, as if Wild Bill's ghost might be watching from across the table, and perhaps, in a way, he still is. Wild Bill Hickok had lived by his own code, A simple one: never draw first, never break your word, and never show fear. He followed it to the end. Even on the day of his death, he didn't panic, didn't run, didn't draw. He met his fate the same way he met every challenge: calm, steady, and unflinching. His killer, Jack McCall, didn't share the same strength. After the killing, he wandered Deadwood drunk, bragging about what he'd done. But the cheers he expected never came. People looked at him with disgust. Even outlaws whispered that shooting a man in the back was coward's work. The makeshift trial that followed was chaos. Deadwood had no real law, just miners and drifters acting as judges. McCall claimed he had killed Hickok in revenge for his brother's death, but no one could find proof that such a brother even existed. Still, the court acquitted him. Justice in the frontier was as unpredictable as a poker hand, but the West never forgot. Months later, when Deadwood came under official U.S. law, McCall was arrested again, this time in Wyoming. He faced a real judge and jury, and this time, his lies didn't save him. He was found guilty of murder and hanged in March 1877. When they cut him down, they found the words "Wild Bill" scratched faintly into his gun barrel. A final, twisted mark of obsession. Meanwhile, Hickok's legend only grew stronger. Writers turned him into a mythical hero, the perfect blend of courage and tragedy. They said his pistols never missed, that he could outdraw lightning itself, that women wept when he walked by. Most of it wasn't true, but the heart of it was. Hickok was brave. He was honorable. He did live by a code that few others dared to follow. The real man and the myth fused into one. In the years after his death, tourists came to Deadwood just to stand by his grave. Cowboys left playing cards on his headstone. Soldiers visiting from nearby forts tipped their hats. Even modern gamblers, more than a century later, still whisper a silent respect when they hold aces and eights. The dead man's hand became more than a story. It became a legend about fate, honor, and the price of fame. It reminded people that even the bravest men fall, that even legends bleed, and that sometimes destiny doesn't wait for you to look up from your cards. And maybe that's why Wild Bill's story endures. Because it's not just about a gunfighter or a gambler. It's about a man who lived by his own rules in a world that had none. A man who faced every fight, every enemy, and finally his own death, with quiet courage. As the sun sets over Deadwood today, tourists still walk the old streets where he once lived. The wind blows through the pines near his grave, carrying whispers of his name. Somewhere, the sound of a saloon piano fades into silence, and in that silence, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the shuffle of cards, the clink of chips, and the calm voice of a man saying, "Deal me in." Long after the gun smoke faded over Deadwood, the legend of Wild Bill Hickok kept growing, carried by stories, songs, and the wind that still whispers through the Black Hills. His death didn't end his story. It made it eternal. The man who once rode dusty trails, enforced law in lawless towns, and faced death with calm eyes had become more than human. He had become the face of the American Wild West, fearless, mysterious, and unforgettable. In the months after his burial, travelers and miners made pilgrimages to his grave. They brought flowers, cards, and coins. Some knelt and prayed. Others simply stood in silence. Even men who had never met him felt they had lost an old friend. His tombstone, simple and unpolished, became a shrine to the spirit of courage that defined a generation. The newspapers and dime novels turned his story into myth. They painted Wild Bill as the perfect Western hero, handsome, honorable, and deadly when challenged. In these stories, he always stood for justice. He was never the villain, never the coward, never the man who shot first. Writers took bits of truth from his real life and wove them into tales that filled pages with drama and glory. Some stories said he once faced 10 men alone and walked away without a scratch. Others claimed he could shoot a coin tossed in the air or a candle flame from across the room. Most of it was exaggeration, but people wanted to believe it. The Wild West was a dangerous place, and heroes like Wild Bill gave people hope that somewhere out there, justice still rode on horseback. But behind all the legends was a man, a quiet, polite, deeply human man who carried the weight of every bullet he ever fired. Hickok was not perfect. He made mistakes, loved and lost, and carried guilt for lives taken in the name of law and survival. That is what makes his story timeless. He wasn't just a symbol of strength. He was a reminder of what courage really means, doing what's right even when it costs you. In the years that followed, the myth of Wild Bill Hickok inspired a wave of Western heroes, both real and fictional. Lawmen like Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp followed in his footsteps, becoming legends in their own time. Writers and filmmakers later built entire worlds around men like him, lone figures who faced evil with steel nerves and cold resolve. Without Hickok, there might never have been the Western movies, the cowboy legends, or the stories that defined American courage. His friend, Buffalo Bill Cody, did more than anyone to keep Hickok's name alive. In his famous Wild West show, Cody spoke of Hickok as one of the greatest men he ever knew, brave, loyal, and fair. He told audiences in cities across America and even in Europe about the man who tamed the frontier with both heart and gun. Thousands of people who had never seen the West came to believe they had, because they knew the name Wild Bill Hickok. Years turned into decades. The Old West began to disappear. Railroads replaced wagon trails, law replaced gunfighters, and the world became faster, louder, and less wild. But the story of Wild Bill stayed. It passed from campfire tales to books, from books to film, and from film to television. His face, once lit by lamplight in saloons, now appeared on screens around the world. Actors played him in silent films, black and white westerns, and modern shows. Each version was different. Some made him a romantic hero, others a haunted gunslinger. But in every telling, one thing stayed the same. Wild Bill Hickok was a man who stood for honor in a world that had almost forgotten the word. Even today, his name carries weight. In Deadwood, his grave remains one of the most visited spots in the entire region. Tourists walk the path up to the hill, past pine trees that whisper in the wind. They leave playing cards, whiskey bottles, or coins at his grave, small tokens of respect for the man who lived and died by chance and courage. His marker has changed over the years, but the message remains simple and powerful. Wild Bill Hickok, a true frontiersman. The dead man's hand, 2 black aces and 2 black eights, still shows up in songs, tattoos, and art, a symbol of both bad luck and the price of destiny. For gamblers, it's a warning. For dreamers, it's a legend. It represents a man who faced fate and didn't blink. Historians still debate the truth of his life, how fast he really was, how many men he killed, what parts of his legend were built on fact or fiction. But maybe that's the beauty of it. Hickok's story isn't just about history. It's about belief, the need for people to imagine a world where courage and honor could stand against chaos. In the end, Wild Bill Hickok was more than a gunfighter, more than a gambler, more than a name in an old storybook. He was the soul of a time that no longer exists, a time when a single man's word could bring peace, when justice rode on horseback, and when courage was all a man needed to survive. He lived by his code and died by it. And though the world has changed, that code still speaks to us. Be brave, be fair, and face your fate with your head held high. As the sun sets over the old hills of Deadwood, the sky turns gold and the wind whispers through the pines. Somewhere in that breeze, you can almost hear the faint sound of boots on a wooden floor, the shuffle of cards, and a quiet voice saying, "The game's not over. Deal me in." And just like that, the spirit of Wild Bill Hickok lives on, eternal, fearless, and forever part of the story of the Wild West.